I'd like to lead you through a discussion of reconciliation. And reconciliation, perhaps as you haven't thought about Indigenous reconciliation before. I'll lead you through a little bit about definitions, to talk about what I believe to be the definition of reconciliation and one of its sort of principal aims and objectives. A little bit about history, and then a little bit about the arc of history and policymaking. How policymakers often tend to go back to the last report they read, the most recent one that's out about a certain subject, whether it's immigration as we're discussing here or reconciliation, and use the last report they made without the full context of the history of the discussion around an issue like reconciliation. So I'm going to give you a sense of some touch points in time. And finally, I'm going to present you with 4 questions that you can use to develop policy around reconciliation. And that's critically important. You have a set of questions as policymakers already that you use to guide you. So you maybe have 3 or 6 or 9 or something that, what are we trying to achieve? Who are we trying to reach? How will this be evaluated? How will our policy be put in motion and implemented? All of these sorts of things. But I want you to add another 4 questions to your arsenal of questions when thinking about reconciliation. So I'll offer you 2 definitions of reconciliation. The first one is the one that I think, most commonly think of when we think of the topic, and that is entering into a new relationship. So reaching some sort of a common understanding. So reconciliation means that at one time we had a relationship that was where we understood each other, one based on respect, and that was lost. And now what we're trying to do as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada is to bring those 2 worldviews, those two ideas together, the idea of entering into a relationship. And I think we do this think of reconciliation as a new relationship for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it leads to actions that we understand. So think of reconciliation as any relationship, for example, that you've had, whether personal or professional. And let's say that relationship is broken and now you have to repair it. And many of us are armed with strategies on how to repair relationships. So, for example, one of the first things that people did when they considered Indigenous reconciliation was apology. And through the 1980s and 90s, the major churches in Canada, the 4 major churches who operated Indian residential schools, thought it was appropriate to start a new relationship with apology. Another tool we use is land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is a new tool we use to establish relationship. What land acknowledgement says ultimately is, I am thinking about you. I'm thinking about who was here before me. I was thinking about whose building this is and who this land or this place belongs to. And that's why land acknowledgement is so important to the reestablishment of a relationship. I am thinking about you. We also think about honoring or acknowledging historic traumas. So it's natural for us then to lay out 215 pairs of little shoes, a memorial in Ottawa or at a memorial in Kamloops or at a memorial somewhere throughout Canada. These are the ways that we conceive of entering into a new relationship, by saying we understand, or we are doing our best to understand trauma, and now we're going to place something there as a talisman or a marker that shows that we've entered into this new understanding. Another way we can enter into a relationship is we can support the development of future potential. This is what Inspire does. Inspire provides bursaries and scholarships to Indigenous students to enter post-secondary education. So you can imagine the number of people throughout Canada, non-Indigenous people, who are very motivated to contribute to this effort. And so we, as a charity, have had tremendous success in guiding the money from Canadians to Indigenous students. And finally, I think writing a common understanding or arriving at a common truth is probably the best way to reestablish a relationship. And that's why truth and reconciliation are often go hand in hand. So when we have a commission, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we probably spend more time trying to establish the truth of our histories, of our shared history, than we do thinking about what reconciliation really is. So entering a new relationship is how we principally think about reconciliation. But what I'm going to challenge you to do a little bit more of as policymakers is to think about it in this way. And I think about reconciliation as a process through which Indigenous people move from the margins of Canadian society to full participation and self-determination. So it's not just about relationship, that's important too, but it's a process that we enter into as policymakers to say, how can we move Indigenous people from the margins to the center and to be fully embraced and participate in Canadian society to the extent that they're self-determining within it. So that's my definition. I think it's important to reflect on how those definitions or how our process is going to be affected by history. And I think it's important when you create policy to think about three principal contexts in history. The first one is the Indian Act. And it's important for you to understand not what the Indian Act says necessarily, but what it was intended to do. The Indian Act is a collection of old municipal policies around controlling the movements and the activities of Indian people at around the early 1900s. And so it persists today as a way of controlling Indian people, now First Nations people, but controlling status Indian people. And it's important to know that probably no other group in society has a similar act within Canada that controls our actions. So for example, if I pass away and I leave in my will, my worldly goods and treasures to my children, if that's not approved by the Minister of Indian Affairs, of Indigenous Affairs, the minister can intervene and redirect my worldly goods to someone else. It never happens, but it technically can happen. So if you look at what the Indian Act is intended to do, it's intended to control the actions of Indian people. So imagine then growing up within the yoke of this legislation. Secondly, we think about residential schools. And residential schools is shocking, really, to Indigenous people because it's something we think about every day. It's something that we've thought about from the moment we knew they existed as children to all the people we've met in our lives and all the relatives we've met in our lives that have attended there, all the stories that we have heard. All of that colors the backdrop of our own lives. And so it is shocking for us when something like the discovery of graves at Kamloops happens, when people said, I had no idea. All of these years, I had no idea that this was real, this was a possibility, that Canadian society had constructed a system that for 100 years has disenfranchised and removed culture and from Indigenous people. 100 years of forced institutionalization. And then finally the 60 scoop, and that was an important marker too, and that's part of the backdrop of any discussion of policy. The 60 scoop happened in actually the 1960s and 70s, where child welfare workers within the provincial systems were given more latitude to remove children they thought were in harm's way and place those children with families that could better take care of them. And remember now, we are allowing non-Indigenous child welfare workers to now look through their own lens, the lens of their own experience, to see the Indian child and say, I don't think this child is well cared for. I'm going to place this child with someone else. And so now we have thousands of people in Canadian society who have been removed from Indigenous families and placed with non-Indigenous families to be raised there. That's the history, but I want to go through a number of touch points, and I think it's important to know that with these touch points, you can see the progression over the last 60 years of what we've thought about reconciliation and what we think is critical to moving together into relationship and to finding self-determination. So I'll go back to 1960, and it may surprise some of you to know that in 1960, within my lifetime, Indigenous people were given the right to vote. And so I like to use that particular marker because it shows that this was when we were first given the opportunity to be meaningful and important contributors to Canadian politics and Canadian society. 1960. In 1964, it was one of the first parliamentary inquiries into the state of Indian people in Canada, and it was the Hawthorne Report of 1964. And this is when we coined the phrase Citizens Plus. And it determined that Indigenous people were on the margins of Canadian society, and within this construct that they had to catch up. They had to be taken from where they were and more fully and brought to more full participation within Canada. Another touchstone I think that's very important to watch and to listen to is the Chief Dan George speech of 1967, when he says he's the lament for Confederation. So against the backdrop of 1967, when Canada was celebrating its 100th birthday, Chief Dan George, who was a movie actor, many of you may know that, but also an actual chief in his community on the West Coast, came forward with his statement, Lament for Confederation. And within there, and I paraphrase, he said, give us the tools of your society. Give us your education, and we will become the most productive citizens within it. So this wasn't a cry for help or a cry for a handout. It was a cry for access to the same tools that everybody else had, remembering, of course, that in 1967, Indigenous people did not have the opportunity or the right to attend universities and colleges. So having been frozen out of that process, he was saying, look, just give us the skills, and give us the tools, and we'll give you back the skills. In 1972, we had Indian control of Indian education. And Indian control of Indian education was a policy statement put out by the Assembly of First Nations. And what it said was, it said something actually that we take for granted today. It said that Indigenous people should have a say, have a meaningful say in the education of their own children. Pretty profound at the time, but now we take it for granted. In 1986, we had the Penner Report, and then we first started talking about self-government. In 1990, my good friend George Erasmus, who was the chairman of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation for many years, gave a speech, an impromptu speech, at a meeting in Ottawa when he was asked, George, now that Canada's coming to its 125th anniversary, what are you most proud of as a Canadian? And he gave an intemperate answer that, to paraphrase again, what do you mean, what am I proud of? Am I proud of the fact that no court in Canada acknowledges Indigenous languages as legitimate? Am I proud of the fact that it took till 1960 to get to vote? Or maybe I'm proud of the fact that while Canada laments 1 million people who are unemployed, or when unemployment gets close to 10%, he says, am I to be proud of the fact that in most of my communities we have 90% unemployment? He says, we don't want anything different from what you want. We just want to have productive and healthy families, an opportunity not to be marginalized and make a useful living and have the good life. And he asked, I think, a really critical question for policymakers, and that is, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? What if Indigenous people were treated the same way as everyone else in Canada? What then would happen? What's the downside? And so we've lived since then as policymakers trying to grapple with that question. Are we doing things and holding ourselves back from meaningful participation of Indigenous people because we're afraid, because we don't understand? I can't stand here on Quanlan Dun and in Whitehorse without acknowledging in 1993 the signing of the Yukon First Nations Umbrella Agreement, which began the discussion of a new order of government within the Yukon. And I think you'll be filling in a lot of those blanks as you go forward in the next couple of days. But the idea of self-governing First Nations, now 11 out of 14 First Nations in the Yukon, and the most progressive agreement of its time, signed by Judy Gingell in 1993. In 1998, we had the Statement of Apology, the Statement of Reconciliation from Minister Jane Stewart as part of the Chrétien government. And this was the reboot on reconciliation. Jane Stewart had come out after reading the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report in the 90s, and she said, we are going to restart this relationship, and we're going to restart it by making a statement that says that there has been valuable contribution by Indigenous people to Canada, and we have to facilitate that continued valuable contribution. And importantly, in that statement in 1998, she said, for all of you who attended residential schools and were abused there, I have to tell you that this was not your fault, this should never have happened, and on behalf of the Government of Canada, we're deeply sorry. So this was her way of beginning a discussion and acknowledging, I think, regret. The word apology was used, but it's never really fully been embraced as an apology by the federal government. That was to come later. I was lucky enough to be a part of probably one of the most impactful healing organizations in Canada from '98 to 2015, and that was the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And so I was there along with George Erasmus and about 60 others, and we cobbled together a package of healing initiatives that we worked with communities on, implemented over the course of 17 years. And I have to tell you, profoundly, I don't think I'll ever get that opportunity again. So perhaps that's also a lesson to you at the stages of your careers. You may be right now working on something that will never come again. That you may be working on something so profound and impactful. Don't let it pass you by. You have an opportunity to make a difference. Policy helps you get there. And so it's important to remember that maybe these are the good old days for you. Just remember that. You may find yourself speaking from a podium 20 years from now and saying, reflecting on these times, and it missed you, passed you by. I think and now we bring up ourselves to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is something that was profound in the way it communicated to Canadians the issues and challenges facing Indigenous people in a way that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People didn't. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People is easily the best collection of reports ever written about the life of Indigenous people and the way forward. But nobody reads it. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is largely derivative of what the Royal Commission said, and everybody knows it. So there's something for you too, as a consideration for policy. Is it better to write the ultimate document that no one reads, or is it better to communicate your document in a way that everyone will engage with and understand, even though it may not be the best? So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gave us a call to action, but it did not give us a prescription to act. And that's a really big difference. It called us to action, but it didn't tell us how to act. And so this is where my frustration comes in when people say, we're fully committed to number 63. Yeah, here at our workplace, number 28, we're all over it. Or number 26, that's the one that we've committed resources to. The True ERC does not call us to act in a specific way. It points out deficiencies in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It tells us we need more health workers. It tells us we need fewer Indigenous people in Canadian jails. It tells us that we need to reform our child welfare system, but it doesn't tell us how to do these things. These things will fall to you as policymakers. So let me give you my 4 questions to add to this, to your arsenal of questions. The first question that you ask as a policymaker is, does this policy engender full participation and self-determination? Does it help that? Does it improve that? And here's where the difference is between participation and self-determination. I believe that Indigenous people have to be full participants in Canadian society, but they don't have to run everything in order to make that something positive. They don't have to take over the universities. We don't have to create parallel systems of education and health and social services and child welfare. That isn't necessary. Those systems are there. We need to indigenize those systems, for want of a better word, and participate fully. And where self-determination and self-government is possible, then that should happen. So that's the first one. The second one is, does this policy engender an increased level of independence? It is so good to help. It feels so good to help. To be a person who maybe studied about Indigenous issues in school, maybe you've gone to Ottawa or to a provincial or a territorial capital and you find yourself engaged with First Nations and you want to help. There's nothing wrong with that. But in our zeal to help, we often create policies that when we go to the community and implement and help implement, when we leave the community, they need us then more than ever. What a terrible thing it is to leave a community after some implementation or intervention knowing that they don't really need you anymore, that you've done your work and thanks, we'll take it from here. That's one of the problems with the development of policy. Are we engendering dependence? Are we creating systems and programs that cause us to be needed more than ever, even if it makes us feel really good? The third point is, does this policy have a mechanism to listen to the community? And it's very important here to understand there's a continuum of listening to the community. And what I'm advocating to you is moving as far along that continuum as your systems and governments will allow. So for example, the first one is, I'd like your advice. I may not take your advice, but I'd like your advice. Give me a little guidance on this. Come to a meeting. Tell us what you think. Okay, that's level 1. Level 2 is, I'd like to consult you. So now it's going to be a little more formal. I have rules to consult you. I may even have a duty to consult you. So I'm going to consult you. I may not listen to what you have to say, but I want you to know that when I leave you, you've been consulted. Okay? That's the second part. The third one is, I'd like some recommendations from you. So not only do I want to talk to you about things, but I'd like you to talk amongst yourselves and give me some recommendations that may help me in the actions that I take. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for. I may not follow those recommendations, but I'd really like them. They're a part of my ongoing relationship with you. The fourth one is direction. I want you to tell me if you want it there or there. I'm not giving you any other options. I just want to know if you want it there or there. So I want you to direct me, and I'm going to give you the authority to direct me. But I set the rules, I set the framework, and I set the parameters. The next one is approval. I'm going to come up with an idea. I'm going to even not talk to you about the idea. And at the end of the day, you get to approve it. You get to approve what you and I have talked about. It's still my framework, but you get to approve it. Now here comes the harder ones. And this is the one I think that we can really, most of us aspire to as policymakers. I want you and I to co-create something together and be in true partnership. Partnership is the most overused and poorly used word in all of our work with Indigenous people. I want you and me to be partners. Really? How come I don't feel like I had anything to do with this? How come all you wanted was my signature at the bottom of the page? co-creation, and partnership. And this is very tough, especially for those of you who are bureaucrats in a federal provincial system, because you know how this works. If you have a new idea or a new policy or a new program, you send it up the line. It may take you a long time to get your idea approved. It comes down from a treasury board or from a minister and it's stamped. It says, all right, you go ahead and you implement this policy and this program. Then you consult. So you don't come to the community with a blank piece of paper. You come to the community with a 99.9% finished policy statement. And then you say, so what do you think? How would you contribute to this? And there's no way for you to change anything. So you become a salesman. You're convincing the community that this is what is in their best interests. You're not co-creating something and entering into meaningful partnership. And then the final step, if you can go that far, is to give up control. And does the policy that you write eventually give up control? To say, we're going to start along this process, but at the end of the day, the issue is yours, the resources are yours, the support is yours, and we have nothing to say about it. So this is what I mean by, does this policy have a mechanism to listen to the community? And how many mechanisms have you considered? All I can tell you is this, is that there's no optimal level of listening to the community that I'm advocating. All I'm saying is as policymakers, it's your responsibility to push that to the farthest extent you can and have the most inclusion that your system allows. The last one I'll leave you with is, does this policy consider Indigenous people in a new way? I have spent quite a bit of my life in universities as an administrator. And I've spent them in university boardrooms. And on the university boardrooms, there's pictures of all the presidents back from when they began all along, and some of them have 10, 12, 15 presidents. And they all look alike. They're all sort of the same. And yet, the university spends a lot of time talking about how policy is going to make a difference. We're going to change things because we want different pictures to be hung on the wall. We want more women. We want more people of color. We want the entire EDI spectrum to be a part of what makes this university run, and so we select new leadership. But if you keep getting the same outcome, and you keep hanging the same picture on the wall, what have you really changed? Have you considered a whole new way of thinking about people in terms of their skills, in terms of their histories, in terms of what they bring to the table? If you keep looking for the same thing, you're going to get the same thing. It's time to look for Indigenous people in an entirely new way. Or that wonderful Indigenous vice president you're recruiting for at your organization, you will never find that person. So I'll leave you with that, and I cannot overestimate how important it is for you to be here, be here in the Yukon. If you sit in your desk in some distant provincial capital and think about Indigenous people and devise ways of understanding what's best for Indigenous people, it will never measure up to a visit to our communities, like here in the Yukon, talking to Indigenous people and seeing what their aspirations and their goals and their dreams are. This is an important part of the process, and I thank you very much for your attention.